We've now come to the moment we're going to look at the conquest of Canaan. And for many people, this is perhaps the most objectionable example or element of violence in the Bible. Reading about war that is ordained and seems to be primarily fought by God, that involves the conquest of a land. We'll read some verses that perhaps make us uncomfortable. Let's look at Deuteronomy 7 as an example, just to get a feel for what we're talking about. It says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy." That verse is sometimes known as herem warfare. In some translations, it's called the ban, but it's talking about coming into the land and saying you must destroy them totally. And I think the question that instinctively we want to ask is, why would God command that? And what do we do with the fact that he does command that? I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where someone who's not a Christian might ask you, hey, what's the deal with all this holy war stuff in the Bible? Like, what do we say? I just want to look at it in a little bit more detail. And I suspect by the end of this session, we will probably still end up feeling quite uncomfortable. I'd like us to, at least if we're going to feel uncomfortable, be uncomfortable about the right things, to have a clearer idea of what was actually happening here, and then can reflect on that and ponder it. I'm going to ask 3 questions. I want to ask, firstly, what actually happened here? Secondly, we'll ask, who did this happen to? And thirdly, we'll ask, why did it happen? So let's think about what happened. Now, I read a couple of verses. I'm going to read them again, but we'll read just a little bit past them as well, so you can see it in a bigger context. We'll read verses 1 to 5, Deuteronomy 7. "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you're to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire." Seems like the eradication of an entire group of people is not what is being spoken about in these verses. Let me explain why. Firstly, the verse talks about the people being driven out. It says similar in Exodus 23, where God says, "I'll make your enemies turn their back and run. I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate, the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little, I'll drive them out before you, until you've increased enough to take possession of the land." Or later in this same chapter, Deuteronomy 7:22, "The Lord your God will drive out those nations before you little by little. You will not be allowed to eliminate them all at once, or the wild animals will multiply around you." There's a difference between destroyed and driven out. Second thing I notice is that there are people who are left in the land. It says don't intermarry with them. Well, don't intermarry with who? That would make no sense if the people were wiped out. They weren't. They were there. They were still around. And so there was a concern about marriage between the two groups. And finally, it seems in verse 5, the focus is not so much on the people, but on the objects of worship. It's their altars, their sacred stones, their Asherah poles that are to be burnt, that are to be smashed, that are to be cut down. There seems to be a narrative of destruction, but a kind of reality of the people still being around. We see the same thing in Joshua. In Joshua 10:20, it says, Joshua and the Israelites had finished inflicting a very great blow on them until they were wiped out. You're like, oh, so they're gone. But then the same verse carries on. And when the survivors had entered into the fortified town, so wiped out survivors, there seems to be two things happening at the same time. Or Joshua 10 says Joshua attacked Debir, and they took the city, its kings and its villagers, and put them to the sword. Everyone in it was totally destroyed. They left no survivors. Except the next chapter. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir. And hang on, Debir, weren't they all gone? Well, no, there's still some here. Same thing happens, Joshua 11:21. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. Except 4 chapters later. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the sons of Anak. We seem to have two things happening side by side. These kind of braggadocious claims of absolute annihilation and an honest recognition that this wasn't actually the case. Seems like there's exaggerated, hyperbolic language going on, which was common. That's how wars were reported in the day. This is the way victory tended to be described. And if we don't quite grasp that that's what's happening and that's how the language is being deployed here, perhaps we're reading something beyond what actually took place. Something about what happened. Let's think about who it happened to. When we think about the conquest of a place called Jericho, we tend to imagine large, bustling metropolises, like big cities, like we get in our own day. Some of our children's Bibles that have pictures will kind of reinforce that a little bit. These were border fortifications. These were like bases, like military bases, really, that would hold a couple of hundred fighting men, and probably servants and sex workers would be there as well. But it wasn't so much like civilian kind of living spaces. Joshua Butler describes it this way: the cities Israel takes out are military strongholds, not civilian population centres. So when Israel utterly destroys a city like Jericho or Ai, we should picture a military fort being taken over, not a civilian massacre. God's pulling down the Great Wall of China, not demolishing Beijing. Israel's taking out the Pentagon, not New York City. And throughout the story of Joshua, there are reports of 3 such bases being destroyed: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. So we looked a little bit about what happened and who it happened to. Why did it happen? Well, it wasn't an ethnically based thing. There's no indication of that. And we see people like Rahab being brought into God's people. But there is something of a divine judgment on sin. In Genesis 15, God's speaking to Abraham, hey, you're not going to go into the land yet. It says, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. He said, look, there will be a time for judgment on the sin of this land, but the seed of bloodshed hasn't yet grown to its full measure where it's time to do that. But by the time that the conquest is ready to happen, then that has spread and grown. In Deuteronomy 9, the Lord said, it's on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. And then describing what that looks like in Deuteronomy 12, it says they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. The seeds of violence have been planted in the land for so long that the harvest of judgment has now finally arrived. In some sense, it's something like the flood that's going on here. So we've seen what happened. Probably not the kind of picture of absolute annihilation that sometimes our minds leap to, but something of driving out, something of kind of taking down the pagan worship. Now, for sure that in this conquest, there were people who got killed, but also we're not talking about the kind of massacre of civilians that it's sometimes portrayed as. It's what happened. Who did it happen to? We're talking military bases. These were soldiers, not civilians, primarily. And why? A judgment on sin, on this society where violence has grown up like a seed, where bloodshed has multiplied, and where they're even sacrificing children on the altars to their gods. And so the judgment of the Lord comes. As I said at the start, I don't think clarifying and understanding this will remove the discomfort we feel in these accounts. I feel uncomfortable as we talk about it. I'm sure you do listen as well. I think it does help us, though, to have a clearer picture of what's going on, and helps us as we try and wrestle some of this through and make sense of it for ourselves.